Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, so with this workshop, we're going to talk about writing up the assignment. I know a lot of groups have already started writing the report. So my guideline here is trying to help you to make the writing better, but I'm not trying to prescribe. This is the way you structure your portfolio. You do have a lot of freedom structuring the portfolio in your own way and designing the whole presentation of your report. So I give you a guideline here if you do not know where to start to write the report. Students always ask for like a past assignment as example. Actually, you don't really need this at all. But I do understand there are past assignments circulating among students, but we make sure every term you get a new case. Copying will not work at all. So the structure of the report can be in this way. So it starts from the title page. You may include the imagined name of the firm or the name of your team. But please do not include your name or student number in there. I'm trying to think of ways of doing a blind marking so that tutors will not identify any team or student. Basically, if you do not include any personal information, that will help a lot. So on the front page, you might be creative, go wild, but not too wild. It's still a business report. So that's the title page, and the most important will follow this summary or overview, not overview of the client's objectives, the overview of the asset allocation advice. So your client will be happy to pay $5,000 for that report, and you want to give your client the most important information on the first page. And you want to impress your client in the first page. So spend more time on this page. Be very careful of selecting the most important things to include in the summary page. At least this should include advised asset allocation, expected portfolio outcome, and also preferably you include how well the client's objectives or constraints are satisfied with this recommended asset allocation. So that's the first page. Then follow that, you are going to have analysis method 1. So a very brief description of the method. Brief means that a short paragraph. So it's going to be the size like probably the size of like this, 3 or 4 sentences. You describe generally the method. You highlight, if you want to, you might highlight the weakness of this method because it might have important implications on the output or the asset allocation advice. You discuss briefly of the data selection, interval, sample period, the data availability as well. So lay out these reasonings still very briefly, unless you want to highlight something that will potentially compromise your asset allocation advice. And most importantly, that's probably your clients will spend more time reading the output. The output from that quantitative or qualitative analysis method, asset allocation, the portfolio forecast, expected return, all of the risk measures, and preferably a brief discussion of why this asset allocation may help the client to achieve the objectives and constraints. And follow the first method, we can discuss the analysis method 2. And don't forget the other considerations. So this might be the implementation issues or other subjective adjustment. So this part 5 can be combined with the analysis method 1 and 2, become part of the method or discussion of the output from both methods. And also, this very important final recommendation. So you have 2 analysis methods, 2 sets of outputs, 2 sets of portfolio outcome, and here comes the final recommendation and your reasoning. That's probably the most important thing you want to highlight. Instead of just calculating the average from the 2 outputs and then calculate an expected portfolio return, you need to provide reasoning. And then, of course, if you use something like the research results from academic or industry research, include this in your reference list. Lastly, if you have something that will help the client to understand your report, but they are not closely related to the discussion or not related to the asset allocation in your report, you might include this in the appendix. So the appendix might include a general description of all of the asset classes within your consideration. So I understand some groups would like to give a table like Australian equity, the characteristics like major growth assets, high volatility, high correlation with commodity price. But is this related to your asset allocation advice? If it is related to your asset allocation advice, you have to discuss the association. Otherwise, this kind of general discussion or description should go into the appendix at the end of the report. Or if you want to have a table to summarize all of the key assumptions like inflation, interest rate, GDP growth, and even commodity price, if you want to include commodity or gold price forecast, you might include this into the appendix. So with that, that's one way to structure your report. Of course, if you want to use other ways presenting your analysis method or asset allocation advice, it's all your decision. I do not prescribe how you might construct this report. The output table provided in the assignment data in the spreadsheet file, it's also suggested as well. You might change that, change the table to make it better, look better in your report, or you can change the table, the contents included in whatever way you believe it will be appropriate to present your results. So, any questions about the writing the report or the word count, the page count? I'm not usually very punishing on the words or page counts if they are not extremely heavier than other assignments. For instance, if you exceed the word limit or page limit by a little, like 10%, 15%, I don't have a problem with that. But if you have a report of 8,000 words, like a book, you probably will get some penalty on that. Just for the time that tutor is going to spend to read the whole report. And also, the clients will not be very happy to read 80-page report. It's not dissertation. I provide a mapping tool. It's right here. Oh, where's my photo? I have modified the mapping tool in the context of the assignment to help you to construct the report, to address all of the constraints, objectives, and concerns of the client. So if you go through the list and if you have finished your report, you go through the list of the constraints, objectives, or concerns. You evaluate yourself. Have you addressed all of these objectives, constraints, and concerns? Are these in an effective manner? So I give you some guidelines to the right that how you might structure your reasoning. So use this when you write your report or organizing your ideas. The marking guidelines, they are provided at the bottom. Where's my assignment? At the bottom of your assignment guideline. So this is going to be given to tutors to mark your assignment. So the first category, recommended as allocation, is not just the first page. The whole assignment is going to be evaluated as a whole package. So when markers are trying to give you a grade on recommended as allocation, they're going to consider these aspects. Like, is there an effective summary at the top? That's probably the investor will be more interested in. And then is recommendation clearly stated? Do they clearly address how the recommended asset classes help the client to achieve their objectives under the defined constraints? So that means that you have output from your asset allocation approach, like this percentage, and you have to explain why this asset allocation helps to achieve the investor's objectives and constraints, not just hitting the percentage target. There are other aspects of the investor's circumstances not quantifiable or not be able to be captured by any quantitative risk measures at all. So you have to include your discussion there. And next was investor's circumstance, stage of life, background assets, implicit exposure, contingencies brought into consideration when making the recommendation. So it's very important you recognize that your client is transitioning to retirement. So this is very important to frame your discussion within the context of the client's stage of life, background assets, like the family home is part of the assets a lot of investors would ignore, and implicit exposures. For instance, if you do have asset allocation in emerging market, you have to understand that this is an additional exposure to emerging market. Within MSCI World Equity, there are already emerging market exposure. And also, if you advise commodity in your total portfolio, you have to understand that Australia is a commodity economy, and there's already commodity exposure in the Australian economy. So Australian assets, no matter they are equity, fixed income, or property, you have already have exposure to property there. So these are the background assets or implicit exposures. And lastly, I will ask the tutor to evaluate. can you follow the basis of the recommendation? The basis means the reasonings, how the analysis and other considerations are brought together. So overall, you have to evaluate the recommendation. So it's 30% of the total assignment grade, the recommendation and the reasoning, the explanations. So you don't need to worry that you have asset allocation into Australian equity as 30%, but the other groups have 20% or 40%. If you have a relatively well-rounded package, you have reasonings, you have explanations, you should be okay. We are not marking your assignment against a correct set of asset weights. So unless they are reasonable. The second category is analysis method. So in this category, the tutor is going to assess from your report. If necessary, they're going to have a look at your Excel files, have some assessment of how well you understand what you are doing. So the analysis method will include some very detailed assessment measures. Like if you mention that in your report, you try to minimize the portfolio standard deviation, probably you won't get 50% in this analysis method. It's substantial, significant error. So that's what tutors are going to assess in the analysis method. Clearly writing down how you conduct the analysis is very important to have a good mark. Other considerations, the implementation issues, tax, the manager access, or other issues related to asset allocation are going to be assessed. Or if you do any additional analysis, for instance, you have 3 analysis methods, and the third analysis method is considered additional work. And if the additional work is meaningful and complements the other 2 methods, you will get very good mark in this category of 3 other considerations or additional work. Some groups may be doing optional part of the assignment, forecasting the financial position of the client. So if you do it in a reasonable way, you will get very good grade from this. And next, the effectiveness of communication. So you probably will see that how well your recommendation will be, how well you run the analysis will account for 70% of the assignment. And the last 30% just purely comes from how effectively you write. So it's still a general assessment of how effective you write in the report. I will highlight this to tutor. You're not going to be punished by making a mistake. For instance, claiming that Australian equity is going to outperform the emerging market equity, or you make some very bold forecast of 3% GDP growth in Australia. You're not going to be punished because of these kind of things. But clearly, we're going to focus on how well you write in the report. How well you write in the report is probably the same standards as we have discussed how you might write effectively to answer a particular question as the questions you see from the exams. I'll show you a few examples on the assignment. So lastly, the basic requirements. So if you run one analysis method, you're going to get some penalties from here. And also submission requirements followed. It's essential that when you upload the file, you include your group number. So when we download the files, they're going to be each group. Basically, you probably will submit 2 files. We have 359 students. when I go to download the files, the Silly Water system will give me 359 folders of your files. So I'm going to get over 700 files altogether. You imagine this, if you all submit a file named as report, model, final report, I can't tell who you are. Sometimes if there are only 1 or 2 groups do this to me, it's okay. I can go back to Wattle and try to identify who submitted this. But if there are 20 groups uploading Wattle as final report, final model, and whatever the file name will be, but you need to include your group number in there. And word and page count, they are very soft. I don't want to punish you if you exceed that limit. And the late penalty. So I particularly make the assignment due on Friday afternoon, so that if anything unexpected happened during that week, during that day, you can still have time to rectify anything and the errors over the weekend. If you submit by 2 p.m. the following Monday, you're going to get 5% penalty only. So it's more like a concession or some extra help. You might make the decision if you want to delay the submission or not. Any questions on the marking criteria? No? Okay, so next we're going to have a look at a report from last year. We tried to find the strength of the report, the assignment, and the weaknesses of the report, and see if we can identify any areas or ways we can improve the writing of this report. So last year, the case was about a retired person who set up, who are putting all his money into his superannuation fund and also charity fund. So here, I just choose the part that addresses the personal superannuation fund. The personal superannuation fund is going to be their only source for retirement living. And this is a very high net worth client, millions of dollars of assets in personal super. So this page is the discussion following a quantitative asset allocation method. So this, I think this is from Bootstrap. Yeah, it is from the Bootstrap approach. So running a Bootstrap, and they manually go to change the asset weights and finally settle onto an asset allocation well-diversified portfolio. And the expected return risk measures, they are actually very similar to this year's assignment. So probability of loss, maximize the portfolio return over a 3-year period. These or illiquidity not exceeding 20%, minimum of 1% in cash. So these criteria are very similar, but a very different client. So here you might have a read of the first and second paragraph. You finished reading? Okay. Now you consider how well these paragraphs are written in terms of effectively explaining the asset allocation advice and its impact on the investor's objectives and constraints. How effectively they are explaining the reasonings. What's your assessment of the grade of these two paragraphs? Effectiveness of recommendation, effectiveness of communication. So what's your grade? Like fail, pass, credit, distinction, or high distinction? What's your opinion? Anyone would like to say? If I want you to grade this assignment, is it a fail? No, absolutely not fail. Is it high distinction? So somewhere between pass, credit, pass or credit. Raise your hand if you believe this is pass. So that will be between 50 to 59% pass. Credit, that's between 60 to 69. Credit, okay. You are pretty good. The effectiveness of this assignment, 65. Now, let's have a closer look at the writing, the style of writing, the effectiveness of writing. So basically, in the first paragraph, they discussed, okay, this is the recommended asset allocation, and this is the potential changes or improvement of investors' portfolio if you follow this asset allocation. So you will see the numbers. That's one very important strength of this writing. They are not just saying, okay, investors' objectives and constraints are satisfied mostly and period. They give numbers, and they are very particular to lay out the change of some objectives and risk constraints, the changes of the portfolio, if the recommended asset allocation is followed. And not this one. And very importantly, they mentioned that the recommended asset allocation will suit the investor's need. So it doesn't mention any preference need, but there are earlier discussions, especially this group, discussed the objectives and preference and concerns in the first page. So that's going to be, they frame their discussions within the client case, although it will be better that you make it clear what kind of preferences. But you can make some guess from their discussion of the changes of the risk measures and the portfolio outcomes. So the first paragraph alone can be very effective to explain the impact of my recommended asset allocation on the client's portfolio or the outcome, expected outcome. And the discussion is framed in client case. If the whole report is written in this way, they are very well positioned to get at least 85% from the effectiveness of writing. The problem is the second paragraph. What's the problem of the second paragraph? As the client, if you put your shoes in the client, which is Mr. Miller, who has, I think, close to $50 or $60 million of net asset value in the investment portfolio, you are asking for advice on the asset allocation, recommend recommended asset changes. And what message do you get from the second paragraph? Is there anything useful, anything specific? Nothing. So the second paragraph should be deleted. Nothing from there is useful for me as the client. I have my very detailed objectives and constraints and my concerns. For this client, the concerns not quantifiable as portfolio standard deviation, for instance, worry about inflation, concern about inflation, and very particularly low interest environment. And that was not addressed at all in the asset allocation, not in the first paragraph at all. So the first paragraph only discussed the recommended asset allocation and how this will help the clients to meet the quantifiable risk measures. So it looks like in the second paragraph, the group tried to discuss, okay, they're like inefficiencies in the traditional asset class. Maybe they want to propose some asset allocation into alternative asset. But is this relevant for me? Well, in what way? If you do want to recommend investment into alternative asset, how it's related to my case? And also there's mention of, I think it mentioned about property market. These are sentences that you copy from other published work. I don't care as a client. I want asset allocation advice that help me to address my concerns. So none of these are actually relevant. If you do want to include these so-called qualitative judgment, subjective discussions into your report, following the discussion of the quantitative output, you have to frame your discussion in the context of the clients. A general description of the performance of the property market or the relatively efficient equity fixed income relative to alternative assets is not sufficient to make your point. So in this report, after the discussion of two methods, they do have a qualitative or subjective adjustment section, but it's very brief. So they believe, okay, we have identified these potential areas that we might improve the portfolio risk-return trade-off, and then lastly, we're going to discuss this. But there's a gap between the identified potentials and the proposed asset adjustment, or asset swaps. So if you want to have make your point in a really forceful manner, you have to discuss here. If you want to, you probably will have two analysis methods, and you don't want to repeat the same subjective adjustment or beliefs twice again. So you might include this in the subjective adjustment section. But in that section, you have to make it extra clear. These are the risk or concerns not quantifiable, not captured by these two analysis methods. And this is our consideration of improving the risk-return trade-off of the total portfolio. And this is the proposed asset swaps or fine-tuning of asset weights. And this is the output, the expected outcome following this fine-tune or adjustment of the asset weights. So if you want to make the point, you have to follow a logic order to organize your ideas. Otherwise, your reader will get confused. Try to avoid this kind of general writing in your assignment. If you want to discuss the Australian housing market, be my guest. You can have a lot of room to do a lot of research on that and have your own belief and make substantial contribution into your report. but you have to frame this discussion in the client case. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. I don't want to read, at least this paragraph. So if the whole report is written in the way as the first paragraph, you probably will get a grade of 85%, around 85% in the effectiveness of communication. But you have something like the second paragraph, the result will be mixed. That's why they get 65%. Next, we're going to have a look at another. I give you a sample of the first page. Is it big enough? No. Probably we'll just read section by section. So that's the first summary page of an assignment. Read through that and see what grade you're going to give to this assignment, just in terms of effectiveness of communication. Put your shoes of the clients and try to imagine if you're the client, high net worth clients, you're going to pay $5,000 for that report. Do you get your questions, main questions, concerns answered in the first page in an effective manner? So you should be okay with the first paragraph. Let's move on to the rest of the page. So there will be a pie chart and a little bit discussion of the expected portfolio outcome. So what grade you're going to give to this group in terms of effectiveness of writing the report, addressing the client's concerns, objectives, and constraints? Do you have an opinion now? Is it pass, credit, distinction, or high distinction? What do you think? From that first page, do you have some good understanding of, in general, the analysis method, the proposed, the recommended asset allocation, the expected portfolio outcome, and do the client's concerns all addressed in this recommendation? Summary of the recommendation. What do you think? Is it pass, credit, distinction, or high distinction? Distinction. Okay, so that will be 70, between 70 and 79. Distinction. Anyone else? What's your opinion? What do you think? Do you have some opinion on this? If you're going to grade this assignment, how do you give the grade? The grade of this assignment is 85%. So let's have a look at the strength of this writing, particularly the first paragraph. So firstly, the approach, the analysis approach, objective incorporated and risk measures incorporated in the analysis method. And what's most importantly is this: the investors' concerns of low interest rate environment, the significant impact from something like global financial crisis are considered in their analysis. And the asset allocation, asset swaps are applied to diversify the identified fundamental risk factors. And then there's a colorful pie chart to present the asset allocation. So it's a little bit confusing if you look at the legends over here, especially for people who are really distinguish red from red, green, and sometimes blue colors. It's going to be quite difficult to understand. And then at the end of the first page, the key constraints are discussed. With this recommended asset allocation, the key constraints, objectives can be satisfied and all of your concerns are addressed. So that's the strength of this assignment. They frame this summary of the recommended asset allocation in the client case. We are very clear that we are working towards an objective to help the client to achieve such objectives and addressing these concerns. And that's our recommended asset allocation. And finally, the expected portfolio outcome. So that's the strength of this assignment. That's probably the first page. So what's the weakness of this? Or you probably can think of any areas. You may improve the presentation of the report or writing of the report. What might be the areas you want to improve if you were going to do this assignment? Oh, we need to hurry up. 7 minutes left. So how you might improve this, the first page? Anyone? So the presentation, the pie chart, there are too many of them in there. So with the pie chart, if you have 4 or 5, even 6, it's going to be quite easy to identify who's who. But here, you're given probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 asset classes. So you really have to be very careful of identifying like this. So Australian cash 1%. Is this 1%? So presenting a portfolio composition in a pie chart of 13 asset classes is obviously not the best choice. And also the color choice, you got to be very careful. Some investors, they cannot tell a color from the other. So it's something that we have to consider, especially in consulting. So this can be presented in other ways. Think about it. I don't want to give you some suggestions. Just don't want you to get you believe this is the prescribed or preferred way of presenting this. So another weakness of the first page summary is that the final paragraph of the expected return and risk measures of the portfolio, they're actually better presented in a table. So that's going to be more straightforward for the client to capture the most important information from the first page. So you don't need to take photo of this. They are available on Walter. So that's, let's have a look at the list of the workshop. Are there anything? Yeah, so we don't really have time to discuss something else. You might have a look at these considerations in consulting. For example, obviously, investment consulting is part of the consulting. It's a sales process. So how you present yourself, how you're going to pretend to be confident will be important to generate sales. Think about this, especially you do want to get into wealth management consulting business. Any questions? Any questions? So we're not going to have time to go through the writing exercise. We're going to discuss this next week. You can continue contributing to that question. I would like to see more writing on this. Next week, in my consultation, if you would like to show me your report, I'm very happy to give you some advice, last-minute advice to make it better. Okay, thank you. That's it for today. Yes.